Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to another week of Joe and Kat Chats. This week we are going to be talking about food security and racism. So buckle up. We have a lot prepared, but I think it is going to be great. So hopefully you'll stick around, and hopefully Joe will be on right away here. I'm just going to add him. And we'll get going, hopefully.
Catherine, good afternoon.
Hello.
How are you?
Hi. I'm well. How are you?
I'm on fire as usual. I just finished
Excellent.
lunch. Since we're just talking about food, I just finished lunch. I had a nice salad, had some kale gnocchi. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. So I had a nice little lunch, and that's it. How are you? How have you been?
Nice. Yeah, I'm good. I actually
Mm,
just finished picking up my CSA box, which is a community food program that I've got. I get it with my friends, so we get fresh vegetables once a week
mm,
delivered. So I have to go pick it
mm.
up a few blocks away. It's lovely.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So what vegetables consist of this box, Catherine? I want to know. Let's talk
So it
about this for a
changes
second.
every week.
Mm-hmm.
This week we got lettuce, kale, fennel,
Mm-hmm.
some carrots.
Ooh,
What else?
okay.
We got a couple of little zucchinis. We
Very nice.
got, what else? I don't know. Last week we got like a bunch of radishes.
Mm, okay.
Yeah, so
All right.
it's different every time. So it's
Very
nice because
nice.
I can be creative culinarily.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, look. I know the borders are closed between the United States and Canada. I'm not going to let that get in the way of my culinary desires. I'm on the next plane up, Air Canada. I'm on the next flight out. I'll be there. It's about 3:30 now. Get to the airport around 6 o'clock. Catch a 7:30 flight. I'll be there by 9. It's on.
Beautiful.
It's
Yeah,
on. It's on. Take Otis for a walk. We're gonna have a nice little lunch and munch, or a little dinner,
that
a little
sounds
dinner tonight.
lovely.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. I'll bring some stuff from Trader Joe's up here in Baltimore. Bring it stuff on the way up. It's gonna be perfect. Ready?
Amazing.
Let's eat. Let's eat.
Oh,
Let's
I
eat.
wish.
Let's eat. And speaking of eating, we're gonna sink our teeth into this topic today. It's gonna be food security, and racism. First of
Yeah.
all, I want to thank everybody that's in the chat right now. We've got a lively 3 people. There are vigorous 3 people. That's okay. It's not the size of the crowd that we're talking to. It's the size of the message that we're going to be delivering today. So that's what it's all about, and that's what we're interested in providing to everybody around the world today.
Exactly. That's
Yes,
great.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
let's get it going. So what
Let's get it
what's
going.
food insecurity?
Food insecurity. Okay, food insecurity is it's a lifestyle. It's where you live a life where you're like, you know what? I don't have enough food. I live in a place where I can't find food. I can't get it. Uh, I can't afford it. I don't have access to transportation to get to the food. That's food insecurity.
Yeah.
You're just like, okay, damn, where am I going to eat tonight?
Yeah.
Where I don't have a CSA in my neighborhood and a bunch of people that I could get a box of vegetables with.
Hmm.
There's no grocery stores where I live. Damn, it's an insecure lifestyle of food. It's literally there's a Latin term that you hear a lot in law. It's called res ipsa loquitur. It means the thing means what it means. Food insecurity is just that. It's like, yo, your ability to get food, it's up in the air.
Yeah. You don't necessarily know where your next meal is coming from. It's
Exactly.
and I actually looked up the definition. It's when someone cannot access nutritionally adequate or safe food that they need on an
Mm,
ongoing basis. So yeah,
okay.
you like you said, it's just what it sounds like.
It's
So,
exactly
and
what it
it's
sounds like.
yeah, and to go even further, it's also related to a bunch of social issues that we're going to get into,
Absolutely.
including
We will
preventable health concerns. So,
absolutely, absolutely. We will
yeah.
tackle all of that. Now, there's another part. Food insecurity's cousin is food security, because that's
Yeah.
also important. Because hey, if you have an insecure food status, naturally the opposite of that would be a secure food status. And food security is the measure of the availability of food that's around you and the availability to access the food. So you have grocery stores nearby. You might have a farmer's market. You might have a group of of lovely Toronto ladies that are like, hey, you know what? Yo, let's join a CSA and get some fresh fruits and vegetables every week. Let's get some radishes and radicchio and some leeks and some kumquats and some peppers and onions and avocados and sweet peppers and sweet potatoes and yams. Let's get it all together. So that's food security. So where you are, Catherine, you're in a food secured area because
I am.
you didn't have to leave your couch today. You were like, yo, I got my food delivered to me. That's
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty lucky to be in this position. Yeah.
That's
It's
amazing.
incredible.
It's
Mhm.
amazing. Now, part of so much of what happens with regards to studying food comes from the USDA. The USDA is a fancy acronym for the United States Department of Agriculture. Now, there are four labels and ranges for food security. You have high food security, where it's, hey, you know what? You don't have any issues getting food. No problems. Like you would be high food security. You know, hey, I can get it delivered, and if I don't feel like getting it delivered, I can go to, well, you're in Canada, so Loblaws, Save on Foods, maybe a Whole Foods nearby, um, No Frills. I'm trying to think of all the Canadian grocery stores, but
Yeah.
I think that's all
That's
of them.
it. Yeah, that's mostly
I think I
it.
got them
Yeah.
all. I think I got them all. So you've got those around you. Now, there's marginal food security where you might have an issue or two getting food. You might not, you might be worried about where you're going to be getting your next meal, or there's a shortage of food in the neighborhood or in your house. So that happens. So both of those two are on the higher food security ranges of food security. Now, the next two I'm going to talk about are on the low range of food security, which actually is somewhat counterintuitive. So it actually would be food insecurity. The next part is low food security, where you have low food quality, your reports of, variety or desirability of food. It's just not around. It's like, okay, where am I going to get my food? Okay, I've got this, but I'm a vegan and it's a whole lot of meat in this place. Or I'm Muslim and there's a whole lot of pork. I can't do this. That's low food security. Now, very low food security is when you're just not eating often at all and there's interruptions in how often you eat. So if you're, for example, in a famine situation, or if you're in a situation where there is some sort of conflict, or if you're in a situation where you live in a particular area where fruits and vegetables, otherwise known as produce, is grown seasonally, and you're just like, yo, yikes, I can't grow this food here, so I'm going to starve. That is very low food insecurity. So the first two parts that we talked about are food secure. The most recent two are food insecure.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that's super accurate. It's the same, I would say, everywhere. There's like levels to the amount of security you have and being able to access food and pay for it because financially the food might be there, but might not be able to afford it, which is an issue that comes up often.
It's a
So,
huge issue that comes up often. It's a huge issue because, again, just like you said so eloquently, Catherine, again, food isn't free. There's an economist years ago, I think his name was Adam Smith, who wrote the book The Invisible Hand, where he said there's no such thing as a free lunch. And it's so ironic that he said there's no such thing as a free lunch and we're talking about food. But he's exactly right. There is no such thing as a free lunch. You have to pay for your food unless you had a program, and there are programs in the United States that allow the most vulnerable and the indigent to have food paid for them, subsidized. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But there's, and I mentioned this in my YouTube, not my YouTube video, in my Instagram video that I did when I was walking around the lake. There are four pillars of food security. Food security has to have these four parts. You have to have availability. You got to have a place to buy your food. Where are you going to get it from? Store, farmer's market, or are you going to grow it? You have to have access. Okay, how am I going to get to these places where this food exists? Or can we flip the script? Can the food be brought to me? In your instance, you don't have an access problem because you have transportation nearby, you've got a car, you've got a grocery store down the street, and if you're just like, you know what, the hell with it, it's hot outside, I don't feel like doing this, yo, bring my vegetables to me, bring me that fruit, Talk to me. So access, utilization. How are you going to use the food? Do you know how to cook? Can you cook it? If you don't know how to cook it, or if you're not ready to cook it, can you somehow preserve it? Do you know food preparation techniques? Do you know how to clean your fruits and vegetables? Do you know how to cook them? Okay, because a lot of and shouts out to my friend Lauren, who I got to visit recently at her place of work, a place called Hungry Harvest, and we talked about this very topic, food, and she showed me the facility and everything else, and what Hungry Harvest does, and they deliver a lot of food baskets to a lot of people around the Baltimore metropolitan area. And humanity squanders 1/3 of all the food it produces. 1/3 of all the food it produces. So it creates a massive waste problem because you're not only wasting food that may not necessarily be aesthetically pleasing. You know, you might have that cantaloupe that has a dent in it that's not perfectly round. So you go to the local store and you're like, you know what, that cantaloupe looks a bit deformed, or that honeydew just isn't doing it for me, honey. Sorry, I'm not buying it. So it ends up going in a landfill. And then food gets in a landfill, and that creates even more of an environmental problem because now you have food at a landfill when, first of all, the food could be consumed. Second of all, if the food gets to a point where it's spoiled, it needs to go in a compost, not a landfill. So then there's the environmental issue of all of that. Sometimes in food security conversations, the word utilization is also substituted for a word called metabolized, which actually seems a bit more accurate because if you're eating food, your metabolism is how your body breaks down the nutrients and minerals and vitamins that comes from your food. So it's literally how your body uses the food. That actually seems like more of an accurate terminology to use rather than just utilization. Because if all right, fine, you could use a potato for a doorstop, but that's not really what a potato is for. You're supposed to bake it, fry it, mash it, whatever. You don't do that with a potato as a doorstop or a paperweight. So it's metabolized. You want to eat it and let everything work through you. And the last part is stability. And stability is how often are you going to be able to get that food? How long are you going to be able to get that food over a particular period of time? Now, we talked about how sometimes you might not be able to get the food because of a natural disaster. Take a look at many of the natural disasters that we've had in recent memory. Hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, tsunamis. Remember the tsunami? Oh my gosh, tsunami. And fruit and vegetable prices went through the roof. Why? Because of supply and demand. That's economics 101. Conflict. If you're in a conflict area, if you're in an area where there's bombs overhead, or perfect example of a conflict right now is what's happening in Israel and Palestine, where Israel is slowly beginning to annex more of Palestine, and the Palestinian people have been vastly under-resourced as a result of oligarchic and militaristic rule by the Israelis. There's a whole lot of Palestinians that aren't eating right now. There is a famine in Yemen right now because of conflict. There's a whole lot of Yemeni kids that are dying because of malnutrition. There's a whole lot of women that can't feed their babies. There's a whole lot of dudes in Yemen that are like, okay, damn it, I don't know where I'm going to get my food from to feed myself and my family. So conflict. And then there's seasonal instability. You might be in an area where your crops might grow tropical, but then you might not be able to grow other crops that might supplement your diet. And then it's like, okay, well, now what do I do? So stability, utilization or metabolization, access and availability. Those are the 4 pillars of what we're talking about with food security.
Oh my gosh, there was so much there. Thank you for going over all of that.
I don't
I
mind.
I think that we should keep those in mind when we continue on because, because those are pillars for a reason. I think that the availability, access, utilization, or metabolization and stability are the foundations of being able to feed not only yourself and your family, but the community members around you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So do you want to get into a few words that you mentioned on your stories, which are food deserts, oasis, and food swamp?
I absolutely think we should because, again, a food desert, a food oasis, and a food swamp, they all they're tied directly into the four pillars of
Hmm.
food security. Now, a food desert, loosely defined, the United States Department of Agriculture defines this, and it's basically an area where you don't have access to food and you don't have access to transportation to get healthy and nutritious food. Now, there are two types of food deserts. The first type of food desert that you have is an urban food desert. And an urban food desert is based upon a geographical particular area in the United States known as a census tract. And a census tract averages between 2,000 and 8,000 people, somewhere in that region. But what happens with a census tract, you take 33% of the population or 500 people, and if that 33% or 500 people does not live within 1 mile of a grocery store or does not have access to get to a grocery store or a supermarket or a place to buy fresh fruits and vegetables or food in that instance, and I keep saying fresh fruit and vegetables, but I really should be saying food because there are 7 types of food that qualify for a grocery store, and we'll talk about them in a few minutes. If you don't have access, then you live in a food desert. Now, the exact opposite of a food desert is a food oasis. That's where you're like, oh, wow, I have grocery stores everywhere. There's a Loblaws down the street. There's a Save On Foods around the corner. There's a Whole Foods 10 minutes drive away. Wow. And I've got the CSA delivering my food to me whenever I want to. That's a food oasis. Now, there's a third food phenomena that's in all of this, and that is a food swamp. Now, a food swamp is when you have a bunch of unhealthy food options in an area. Corner stores, bodegas, junk food places, liquor stores, convenience stores. That is a food swamp. Now, in terms of obesity, and there's plenty of literature about this, you're more likely to have food swamps are a better predictor of unhealthy eating than a food desert. And
Hmm.
part of the reason why is with a food swamp, you're more likely to have junk food, processed food, low likelihood of fresh vegetables and fruits, poor quality meats, pre-processed cereals and grains and breads, poultry that's not exactly fresh. And this is a dad joke. You're going to have poultry that's actually kind of foul. Uh,
Oh
I
no.
know, I know, I know. Yeah, I know, I know. So, yeah, so you're going to have these issues with food in a food swamp. And naturally, if you're eating poor quality foods, pre-processed foods, high sugary foods, you're more likely to have poor health outcomes as opposed to a person who lives in a food desert where they might only be able to get fresh fruits and vegetables and other types of higher quality meats or fruit or poultry or fish when they have an opportunity to do so. So they're going to be a bit more health conscious about their food choices.
Hmm.
I remember, just as an aside, I remember when I was living in Winston-Salem, North Carolina a couple of years ago, and there's an intersection of Stratford Road and Miller Streets. And at the intersection of Stratford Road and Miller Streets is a intersection called Five Points Intersection. That's where they had the most recent Black Lives Matter rally where I posted up the other day. And that area, there are 5 grocery stores within, and if you don't get the traffic lights, a 30-second drive from each other. At the one stretch on Stratford Road, there's Harris Teeter Trader Joe's. Then at the corner, there's a Publix. And then across from that is a Trader Joe's. And then down the hill on Miller Street is another Harris Teeter.
Hmm.
That's just grocery stores. We're not even talking all of the places where you can walk in and get a sandwich or go to a cafe that's also in those areas also, or the Indian restaurant or the diner down on the corner. So it's entirely possible to be in a food oasis and have a food swamp because you might have fast food areas that are in close proximity to grocery stores. You might have a 7-Eleven or a gas station that also functions as a convenience store where you can pick up a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk and keep everything moving. So it's entirely possible to have a food oasis and a food swamp at the same time.
Right. Right. Exactly. That was really well put. Thank you again. Oh my gosh. So, Yeah, you're on fire today, Joe.
It's been an emotional few days, Kat.
Yeah,
It's been an
fair
emotional
enough.
few days.
Fair enough. So, yeah, so I think that there's a lot to be said about which areas are food deserts and which ones are food oasis or food swamps,
Yes,
um, in the sense that we're also talking about racism today. And
we sure
so,
are.
a main thing that I want to ask everyone to look up is redlining. It's a concept that means that there have been historical discriminatory practices
Absolutely.
where originally it was banks that would avoid investing um, and providing home like loans for mortgages and stuff based on
Absolutely.
community demographics, which
Correct.
primarily are linked to race and low income or poverty.
Hmm.
So I think that this is a really important concept, and people should be looking into it for more than just food security.
I agree.
But for the purposes of today,
Hmm.
um, food deserts are primarily a problem in low income, poor, rural areas that are racialized.
I agree. And a rural food desert takes the geography and expands. It makes
Exactly.
it makes it bigger. So instead of a 1 mile area, a rural food desert expands the distance to 10 miles.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, which makes sense because I mean, you could be in the middle of nowhere, for example, in Alberta, and you're like, okay, well, damn, my nearest grocery store is a 45-minute drive away. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
food desert. Real quick, hold on 1 second. Let me show you something.
Oh, sure.
You
While you're
mentioned
gone.
redlining.
Oh, yeah.
You, you mentioned redlining. This is an amazing book. This book, The Color of
Uh,
Law, The Color of Law, in my Black History Month book series from, gosh, 5 months ago. This is one of the first 5 books that I mentioned. And if you read that in the bottom right there, it says A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And if you take a look at that, that is a map. And this book talks almost exclusively about housing policies that racialized America. And a bunch of this book talks about redlining.
mhm.
So
Yeah,
The
and I
Color
think
of Law, Richard
redlining,
Rothstein.
nice. Thank you. I
You're
appreciate
welcome.
that recommendation.
Not a
Um,
problem.
yeah, and I think that redlining is a main concept of the Black Lives Matter movement that people need to be aware of right now. And
It's a huge
so
problem.
we talked about intersectionality a couple weeks ago,
We
and
did.
so this is like an aspect of how um, this phenomena of redlining has influenced the population, the Black population, for years and years and years. And
Yes.
so yeah, I think it's something that we always need to have sort of in our minds because it helps to under us to understand why these issues are so pervasive in these
Hmm.
particular communities.
Absolutely, absolutely,
So
Catherine. And when you talk about segregated housing policies, racist, let's call it what it is, racist housing policies, this is what they are. Because there were plenty of black people in the 50s and 60s that had the capital to go ahead and buy a house. But then there were racial covenants in the deeds of houses that prevented many of these areas where houses were being built, these neighborhoods, prohibited black people from buying homes in these areas. In addition, it prevented black people from renting in these areas. So it then created this massive racial wealth gap. And next week, we will be talking about the racial wealth gap. So stay tuned for
mhm.
that, everybody. But when you mix in these sorts of geographic redlining, blockbusting, which is another concept that I'm sure is mentioned in this book, redlining, blockbusting, and then you mix in food with that, you have a terminology called food apartheid.
Yes, absolutely.
And
Yeah,
that
and
is
I think it's
exactly what food apartheid
important.
is.
Yeah, exactly. It's important also to realize like it's just sort of a snowball effect because if you're not
Absolutely.
giving particular people access to like mortgages, then who wants to invest in, small businesses or open a grocery store in a place that's like clearly geographically going to be um, quote unquote desolate as far as it's basically they're predicting where poverty is, and so it's creating this snowball effect of like a food desert becoming the reality for most of those people. And I also just wanted to
Exactly.
mention, while I'm thinking of it, that the reason there's a difference between the urban and the rural, um, I guess, distance criteria for a food desert is because
Yes,
of transportation needs. So in an
absolutely.
urban area, there's a higher percentage of people that don't actually have access to transportation vehicles, or and they rely on public transit, which is notoriously unreliable in many, many, many cities,
True.
especially in the States. And so, yeah, so, and the rural areas, usually there's like different access to transportation that like allows for this longer distance to be considered a food desert. So,
Absolutely. 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 And since you talked about, I guess, certain disadvantaged areas not being able to have a grocery store, food deserts, there, there's actually certain types of food that you actually need to have in order to be a grocery store.
mhm.
You need fruits, you need vegetables, you need dairy, you need poultry, you need meats, you need seafood, and you need grains and or breads and or cereals. So there's 7 types of food. Now within fruits, you can't just say, oh, you know what? I've got a golden delicious apple, I've got a Granny Smith, and I've got a pink lady apple. No, it doesn't work that way. You need at least 3 different types of fruit. So if you've ever been to a casino and you play the slots and then the 3 different fruits come up, you've got like an apple, a banana, and a cherry, that's what you need. You need 3 different types of fruit. With vegetables, if, in order to be a grocery store, you need at least 4 different types of vegetables. So you can't have iceberg lettuce, romaine lettuce, and then 2 other types of lettuce. No, you got to have potato, tomato, cucumber, garlic.
Yeah.
Four different types of vegetables. Now, dairy, poultry, fish, meats, there's all sorts of rules for all of those. You have to have different types of refrigeration. They have to be separated in particular areas. Your grocery store has to be a certain amount of square footage. There's all these rules that you have. But in terms of the types of food that you need, 7 types of food. And those are the 7.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Thank you for outlining that. And yeah, like
It's
you
not a
said, when we
problem.
were talking about utilization, I think it's important to not only have those types of foods, but know how to cook them
Know how to
and
cook them.
know how to nourish yourself with those foods, because it's really easy to pick up something that's pre-prepared, but the nutritional value might not be as high as a fruit or a vegetable that you might pick up and not know what it is and not know how to cook it. So then you just put it back on the shelf. So I think that's an important conversation as well, because there's a lot of folks that don't know how to cook stuff, and like I recently rewatched a TED Talk that I found very inspiring when it came out, which was like
Mm-hmm.
9 years ago, by Ron
Yeah.
Finley. He's the
Mm-hmm.
guerrilla gardener from
I know
South
Ron
Central
Finley.
LA.
Yep.
He's like one of my favorite, most inspired humans. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he talks about like when a kid grows kale, they'll eat kale. You don't have to like push them or whatever. You don't have to like convince them to eat something because it's weird or whatever, because they saw it grow and they're interested and engaged. So I think that
Exactly.
there is a whole conversation that we can have about food and kids and the exciting prospects of having community gardens or food programs
Yes.
in schools that actually teach kids how to grow food.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And kind of getting back to something that I want to tie into all of this, we talked about environmental racism. We alluded to that a couple of episodes ago, and we just talked about redlining about 5 to 7 minutes ago. Now, another part with regards to community gardens that is also a problem in certain cities is lead
Mm.
paint. Now, if you, in many instances, lead paint, lead gets into the soil as a result of homes being demolished, gentrification, etc. Now, if you have lead that gets into the soil, you can't grow anything in that soil because the soil is contaminated. So now, if you want to grow it, go ahead and have for example, a hoop house in terms of urban farming. You now have to have raised planter beds in order to grow in those particular areas where the soil has been contaminated. Now, when you start talking about having raised planter beds, it takes up more space. So it dramatically reduces the amount of what's called a crop yield, which is the amount of fruits and vegetables you are actually able to grow in a specific geographic space. So if you have these planter beds that are taking up space and you have to plant a bunch of them in a particular area because this plot of land has been contaminated as a result of lead paint, that also creates a potential food instability because you may not be able to get food all the time, all year round. And again, it's an issue that again needs to be addressed. Part of that comes from redlining, blockbusting. Part of that becomes institutional racism. But part of it is just, you know what? Let's stop using lead paint. Let's eliminate lead in people's homes because there's been loads of information about how lead can tear kids' minds up and mess with their mental, their mental abilities and everything else, respiratory issues. Lead is a huge problem. And it's not only just because a kid might ingest it, it also might mean that you can't grow anything on that soil.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's so true. And I think that the issue of environmental racism is an important one in this conversation as well. Like you say, not only is it sort of, I guess, contamination of soil itself, but when you're talking about trying to create initiatives like a community garden, um,
Absolutely.
building those raised beds is also expensive. So when we're talking about people who are food insecure already doing that, it's just not a thing that's going to happen. If their environment is also contaminated and they do need to do that, so there's this like systemic oppression like built into these areas too
Hmm.
are also implicated with all of this stuff that we're talking about. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
And in addition to food insecurity, if you have a hoop house in an area that is, let's just say, disinvested, disadvantaged, there's going to be a security issue anyway. So larger homeless population that might walk in and take from your garden. Hey, you know what? That kale looks pretty good. Those tomatoes, I'm hungry. Let me grab a couple of those. You might have certain types of vermin that might affect your crops, like rats. You might have rats that might come in and say, yo, you know what? This parsley looks yummy. Dinner time. Let's eat. Next thing you know, your hoop house that you're trying to grow produce in isn't necessarily as productive.
Hmm.
So you do have that. And that's an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's lots of factors involved with I guess proposals of how to mitigate these issues that we're talking about, as far as being food insecure. Another one that
Yes.
comes to mind, given that I live in Canada, is the seasonal aspects of that. Like if you're trying to create
Yeah.
initiatives, like a community garden, like that's a very seasonal thing here. So
Hmm.
I just don't want to like promote these things without the understanding that it's a systemic issue, and it's
Right.
not, these are kind of band-aid issues or band-aid solutions to an issue that's much larger than that.
Right, right. And in many instances, the Band-Aid solutions that many people, many politicians and government officials offer are Band-Aids where reconstructive surgery is actually required.
Exactly. Yeah.
Total reconstructive surgery. Now, one of the questions, now we don't actually spend a whole lot of time prepping for these conversations. We're just like, hey, you know what? What do you think? Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Let's talk about this. We come up with an outline about 30 minutes before the show, and then we just let it go. We just let it flow. One of the questions I asked you earlier on was, does Canada have a food supplement program similar to what the SNAP program is in the United States? Do you all have something like that?
No, Canada does not have something like that, which is a huge issue. So what
Mm-hmm.
happens in Canada is
Mm-hmm.
we basically, if you're on welfare, which is just the subsidy program for like those who are uh, really low income, there's like
Yes.
a portion of that that's allocated to food. But otherwise, the government and Canadians in general rely on food programs like food banks, food
Hmm.
boxes, community gardens,
Okay.
these community supported agriculture. And so there's a really big issue because they're relying on these organizations that may or may not be there next week, or, they may or may not be able to provide the foods that you want or need for your family. And a lot of times the access is constrained because a lot of these organizations are in urban centers. There's financial constraints and barriers, but there's also stigma. A lot of people don't
Yes.
access food banks, for example, because there's a stigma and you don't want to be seen having to access these programs.
Right.
And so, yeah, so there's like, I think it's a really big issue in Canada. Not to mention, uh, there's a large amount of communities that are rural that don't even have food banks or any of the organizations that I just mentioned.
Right. Right. That's sad.
Yeah.
That's rough. That's tough. Now, in the United States, we actually have a program called, it was years ago, it was called the Food Stamps Program, but then they rebranded it, renamed it, and called it the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as SNAP. Now, SNAP is managed by each state, yet the limits on how much money you're allocated comes from the federal government. Now, what they do is they take, now there's income eligibility limits. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about income eligibility and the federal rate of poverty
Hmm.
and how the and the coverage gap where if you are at 100% to 138%, you're in that coverage gap. Well, for gross monthly income, it's 130% of the 100% of federal poverty rate, which is administered by the Department of Health and Human Services.
Hmm.
And then your net income has to be at 100%. So just so we have some actual numbers, 130% of the federal poverty limit based upon last year's numbers, because they didn't update it for this year. They're using 2018, 2019 numbers instead of 2019, 2020 numbers, which is actually, no, I'm sorry. They're using 2019, 2020 numbers
Yeah.
because for the healthcare, they're using 2020, 2021 because they already kind of know what they're doing in advance. So for 130% is $1,354 per month. 100% is $1,041. And then there's some calculation that's involved with all of that, net income, gross income, expenses, etc. And it works out that the monthly allowance for an individual who receives SNAP benefits is $194 per month. $194 a month, which works out to about $50 a week. So you're thinking, okay, well, damn, I'm getting $50 a week. You'll be surprised how far $50 a week does not go. You'll be shocked. And that's for an individual. Now, for families, the numbers increase. And then once you get above 8 family members, then it's just you just add a particular amount of money per person, and it keeps going up. Uh, I remember years ago when I was an intern at the International Rescue Committee, and I was helping many of the Syrian refugees enter the United States. The first thing we did was they gave them a housing orientation. Right after that, we took them to the health clinic to get them checked out. Then we took them to social services to begin the process for getting them the work permits, social security cards, and their SNAP benefits card, which comes literally on a card. It comes on what's called an EBT card, which means electronic benefits transfer. So every month, and the way you would get it in Maryland, it was based on a particular schedule. So if your last name started with AA to, I don't know, DI, you got your benefits on the first of the month. And then it kept going all the way through. So based on your last name, the first two letters of your last name, that would tell you their schedule of when you expect your EBT or your benefits to be transferred to your card. And I vividly remember working with many of these families who had 6 and 7 people, and they were getting, almost $1,000 a month for food, which was like, wow, that's a lot of money for food. But then you've got 7 people, and then you've got a couple of kids that are under 3 years of age, where formula is going to be expensive. And with regards to the SNAP rules, there's certain foods that you can't buy. So, for example, if you're at a grocery store with a salad bar, and they've got a hot food bar next to it, can't buy the hot food. Can't do it. If you're in a grocery store and you're like, yo, you know what? These paper towels might come in handy. Can't do it. It's got to be for food. And there's strict rules with regards to it, but I remember one of the strict rules was you can't buy prepared food. So if it's at a hot bar with, rotisserie chicken, no, that can't do it. It doesn't work that way. So in many instances, and I experienced this with working with a group of Burmese refugees when I was living in North Carolina. In many instances, you're going to have problems when you have people who live in a food desert. In many instances, many of the people don't necessarily speak the language or don't understand what they're reading, and there's not necessarily culturally relevant food in your particular area if you're in a food desert. So, perfect example is when I was working with the Burmese refugees in the Cottage Grove area of Greensboro, North Carolina. And part of what I needed to do for that project for school with the second master's degree was to develop an instrument to determine why the rates of asthma and pre-diabetes were higher among Burmese refugees than with other refugee groups in the Cottage Grove area of Greensboro, North Carolina. And what I found was, they were in a food desert, but a lot of Burmese people like a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables. Well, if you're in a food desert, you can't always get that. So why were their rates of diabetes higher than other refugee groups? Well, part of the reason why is because they were getting SNAP benefits, but they weren't getting a whole lot of money on their SNAP cards, on their EBT cards, and they were basically buying large bags of rice, huge bags of rice. So then the next thought was, well, wait a minute, they ate rice when they were refugees in Myanmar. And then when they came over from Laos or Vietnam and got into these refugee camps, they were eating rice there too. Why were they not pre-diabetic in a refugee camp, but they come to North Carolina and all of a sudden they're pre-diabetic? That doesn't make any sense. Well, part of the reason why is they were eating more diverse diets over there. So they had access, in addition to just rice, they were supplementing it with fresh meats, other types of vegetables. So they weren't just eating strictly rice. So rice, as I'm sure you know, is a high carbohydrate, high starch food. So if you eat a lot of that and you don't exercise because you're in an area that is primarily redlined or not necessarily safe to exercise in, or you don't have sidewalks, then all of those bowls of rice are going to make you fat. It makes you fat, raises your blood sugar, pre-diabetic condition. So all of the housing issues that we talked about with environmental racism and then what you mentioned with regards to redlining and what I mentioned with blockbusting and a lot of what you could learn about in this book, The Color of Law, and then you mix in a food desert because there's not a grocery store or a corporation that's willing to invest in these disinvested areas, you then get all sorts of problems with regards to finding culturally relevant food for your community. You also get problems with kids not being able to get access to lunches, not being able to have 3 square meals a day, especially now in a pandemic where kids aren't going to school, and they may not necessarily be going to a summer camp. And at least at a summer camp, they might get something to munch on a couple of times a day. Then they come home to get a meal at night, shut it down, read a book, go to bed. Can't really do that now because kids aren't even going to camps anymore.
No. Yeah, I think that there is the heightened vulnerability is just sort of trickling into every aspect of our lives right now during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely.
And one thing I wanted to, I guess, just unpack was when you were talking about the program where you're getting your your I can't remember what you called it. Could you remind me?
EBT,
Yes, thank you.
EBT,
The
electronic benefits
EBT.
transfer.
Yeah, so that amount of money is probably not that much, like you mentioned. And so, you know, a lot of these families are probably looking for foods that are going to fill them up and are not necessarily nutritionally dense. So I think that there's, you know, the assumption is like, oh, you can just like feed your family with this, but if you have a large family and only a certain amount of money, you're gonna pick foods that are gonna fill you up every day and not necessarily, you know, be lettuce, which is like a food that costs money but doesn't really fill you up that much, I guess.
Correct.
So yeah, just like processing that makes me think about it more in you know, in allowing us to sort of understand like where the problems are within these
Hmm.
programs, because the programs are
Absolutely.
necessary. I think we
They
should
are.
absolutely have those programs, but
Hmm.
there's issues with these programs that we could be helping, and it's also discriminatory to tell people like what they can or cannot eat.
There you go.
But I guess
There you
that's
go.
we can talk about that uh,
Yeah, and
another time because
that's another huge issue. And
mm,
and I keep going back to when I was working with refugees years ago. I remember working with a Pakistani family. Actually, it was a father and son, and they were looking for and they were devout Muslim, and they were looking for a halal meat store. And I'm
mm,
like, I have no idea where a halal meat store is. And they're living all the way in a two-bedroom apartment in Pikesville. And the only halal meat store that I could think of was on, and again, this is all Baltimore stuff, which is on 33rd Street, right near Johns Hopkins University, which is not exactly close to where they live. So I remember going out one morning, picking them up. Let's go. Drove all the way down there, went to the halal meat store, picked up all their stuff, drove all the way back out there because where they were living in Pikesville is a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. So you're
mm,
not necessarily going to have halal meats in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. Big issue,
yeah,
huge issue.
yeah.
And you're already on SNAP benefits. And I remember the guy's, my brother's name was Mohammed, and I remember him telling me, Joe, I cannot eat in this neighborhood. I can't eat in this neighborhood. There's no food for me here. Where am I supposed to go? And I remember him calling me up in that morning. I'm like, well, all right, look, Mohammed, let me look up a halal meat store. Let me call you back. It's a real issue. It's a real
Yeah,
issue, especially when you don't have culturally competent food sources around you for the culture and the community that is in that particular area.
yeah,
It's an issue.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's my goodness, yeah. It also brings to mind like if you are already on SNAP benefits too, like and you have someone kind enough to take you to the meat store
Yep.
across town, like how often is that available to you? Are you going to be able to get enough meat and store the meat for long enough for you to you know to eat it regularly or whatever you're used to? Because when you're a refugee, like normalcy is what anyone would gravitate toward if they're in a new place. And so food is such a communal thing.
Bingo.
It's a family event. It
Yep.
brings about so many emotions with us. It's a way for us to connect to each other. And so when you're in a position where you're just like randomly placed in this, you know, new city because you're a refugee, like
New country.
you new country, exactly. Yeah. So you would want to have access to that, but a lot of these places you just don't.
You
And when
don't.
you do, you either can't afford it, you can't get to it. All of this is like wrapped up in this food security issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so
Yep.
important to examine these things, I find, because once you start getting into it, you're like, oh, well, that's like a way that, you know, discrimination is being perpetuated and racism is being perpetuated and so on and so forth. And so it becomes like more and more topical right now because we started these chats because of, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd's death. But like, look at us now. We're talking about food security
Food.
and
Food
how
security. How it
relevant it
affects.
is right now.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. And and again, there's a term that I think a lot of us use when we're buying food, especially when you come from one country to another. And I wasn't born in this country. I was born in England. My parents are from Trinidad. So I grew up primarily eating a Caribbean diet. There's a term that a lot of people use when there's a particular meal that makes them feel good about themselves or reminds them of home. It's called comfort food. Comfort food. And I really hope people understand the the significance of that in this conversation. Because if you come from another country and you're already disoriented, you're already meeting a whole bunch of people that you've never met before that don't look like you, that don't speak your language, that don't understand your culture, that don't understand your religion, that don't understand your personal beliefs. And now one of the two things that you make that really make people feel like themselves, one of them is music and the other is food. And you're not necessarily going to find their music in this country, but you would hope you could find that food because food makes you feel comfortable. You feel better. You feel good when you eat that entire pint of Haagen-Dazs ice cream. You might feel terrible in the morning, but you feel good in the moment. Or you feel good when you eat all of those chips and the entire tub of hummus. And I'm still wondering why hummus has an expiration date because it never lasted that long in your refrigerator anyway. Never lasts the full 6 or 7 days. Refrigerate when eat open. No, it's done. Bye. See you later.
So true.
Gone. No matter how big it is. Unless it's that big 32-ounce of Sabra that you buy at Costco, then nah. That might last 2 or 3 days. But other than that, no, hummus doesn't need an expiration date. Just chip and
Yeah,
dip.
agreed.
You're
Agreed.
moving.
I'm the same
You're
way.
moving. You're moving with that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's you mentioned food and I mentioned music. Barbecues, cookouts. That's why people have them because it's a celebration of life, food and music.
Hmm.
And that's what makes people come together. That's conversations like this make people come together. Food and beverages, water, and obviously water. We didn't even talk about water and how water is being commoditized. Look at all the stuff that's happening with Nestle in Canada. Look at all the
Hmm.
craziness that's happening there. Look at all the craziness that's happening in Baltimore with lead in the water here in Baltimore and lead pipes in Flint, Michigan. So you want to talk about food insecurity. Look, you can go realistically about 21 to 30 days without food. You can't go 3 days without water.
Hmm.
So I think maybe maybe and again, I haven't seen a whole lot of literature or videos or conversation about this, but I certainly think water security and water insecurity is something that absolutely needs to be researched and discussed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I mean, when my parents are from in Trinidad, there are certain, and then Trinidad is an island country, and there are certain times of the day or night where you can't get water in an island country. I remember hanging out in Sarajevo the first or second time, and sometimes they just randomly turn off the water. What? How could you? Where's my water?
Yeah.
So water security and insecurity, I don't even know if that's a thing, but if it is, I apologize for my ignorance. If it's not, then we're the two smartest people on the planet, at least on Instagram Live right now, because we just came up with it. Water
Yeah.
security, water insecurity. We're innovating on the
Yeah.
fly. That's how we
There
do
you
it.
go.
It's how we
Yeah, and
do it.
I think it goes back to our conversation about, or the conversation that keeps getting brought up for us is with environmental racism. Like
Absolutely.
where our water comes from is heavily implicated in the community, or I guess what I'm trying to say is the communities that have toxic water is usually the communities that are downstream to industry. And so when
Perfect.
those industries pollute the water, those
Yes.
downstream communities tend to be racialized and in poverty. So
Absolutely.
again, like these issues are coming up over and over and over again because like these are systemic issues that are just pervasive in our society, and this is why everything is intersectional, and that's why we spoke about this a couple weeks ago, because like
Absolutely.
once you start trying to dismantle the systemic oppression and racism, you realize that well everything's pretty well connected, and in certain ways, like, these people have been historically marginalized in not only just for being Black or Indigenous or people of color. It's so deeply rooted in the system that we've set up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And something else that I think also needs to be discussed, and we're seeing this phenomena more and more in the United States, and I know I've seen a few in Canada, is the rise of the dollar store. The
Yeah.
rise of the dollar store. And there's more, there's dollar store, there's Dollar Tree, there's Dollar General in the United
Mm-hmm.
States. And in many instances, these dollar stores prevent grocery stores from opening in areas where there is an obvious need.
Yeah.
Because if you're a grocery store franchise or chain and you see a Dollar Tree here and a Dollar General around the corner where people are just going in there buying eggs, bread, and milk, and they can get a couple of boxes of macaroni and cheese with their SNAP card, then why am I going to go ahead and open this 15,000 to 20,000 foot grocery store in this area where people aren't going to have necessarily the resources or the access or the availability to get the food there, or the stability because they might not have necessarily have the income week to week or day to day or month to month to buy the food from a grocery store. So I think one of the and I know we're running out of, we got about 4 minutes left or so. We want to try to come up with some solutions. One of the solutions that I think absolutely needs to happen is government. And again, I'm big on policy. Government needs to go ahead and say, hey, look, if you're a dollar store, you need to limit the size of your dollar store. Limit the size of your dollar store. And if you're a dollar store, you don't need to be having 30 dollar stores or 30 different brands of dollar stores within a specific geographic area. There's no need for that, because in these geographic areas where you constantly have all of these dollar stores, that could be an area where a grocery store or two or three could be built and would be better off serving that community with a grocery store rather than a dollar store. Because with a grocery store, they're usually a chain or a franchise. And guess what grocery store jobs are?
They're
Unionized.
essential. Oh, I was like,
They're
okay, yeah,
unionized, which means you're going to
yeah,
have benefits and you're going to be
yeah,
taken care of and you're going to be paid somewhat decently, which
yeah,
also helps the people in that area to maybe have some sort of wealth later on down the road, maybe a pension, maybe more than a few dollars in their checking and savings accounts. Oh, maybe access to healthcare because healthcare in the United States is tied to your job. So a grocery store would certainly be more beneficial than having a bunch of dollar stores around.
agreed. Yeah.
Farmers market is another great
Hmm.
way. Farmers market. When I used to live downtown Baltimore many years ago, actually about 5 years ago, the Baltimore Farmers Market was a 5 minute walk away from me. 5 minute
Hmm.
walk. And every Sunday, early in the morning, Sunday before I go play soccer, when I was actually home on a Sunday, walk down to the farmers market, pick up a couple of samosas, pick up a couple bundles of kale, get my tomatoes from the guy in Harford County, pick up some corn,
Amazing.
you know, buy some shea butter because they had some natural shea butter that you could get all sorts of stuff at the
Yeah,
farmers
it's
market down
great.
there. All sorts
Yeah,
of stuff at the farmer market. It was
that's
great.
that's amazing. Yeah, that's something that I would actually push for is, the USDA, if we're talking policy, like, the USDA is already subsidizing agriculture in a large way anyway. So why
Hmm.
don't we subsidize folks for setting up, community run farmers markets,
I
and
agree.
have food available to people that aren't necessarily getting it right now, and also teach them how to eat and prepare and do all of these things. And we are actually running out of time.
I know.
We have less than a minute left,
I know.
but yeah, this is such an important issue, and I'm so glad we got to chat about it today. And thank you so
Likewise.
much for continuing this conversation. It's been
Absolutely,
a
Miss Wells.
pleasure.
Pleasure's
Yes, and
always mine.
thanks.
You know that.
Oh, mine too. And thanks to everybody watching the comments. I'm so grateful that you commented.
Yes.
I'm sorry
We
we
love
didn't
you.
get to address any of the comments, but they were great, and thank you. So, my goodness, what are we doing next week, Joe?
Wealth inequality. We're talking about wealth
Yes.
inequality and racism, racial wealth gap. We're diving deep.
Yeah.
We're diving in.
Yeah, it's going to be
Head
another one
first.
not to miss.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks
Take care.
again. You
Yes,
take
ma'am.
care. Much
You're
love.
the best. Love you
All
too. Take
right.
care.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.